I'm Carter Robinder, and I want to talk about the disability rights movement. Specifically, I want to talk about some of its achievements. Now, the first of these achievements was Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. The section reads, "No otherwise qualified individual with a disability in the United States shall, solely by reason of their disability, be excluded from the participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance or under any program or activity conducted by any executive agency or by the United States Postal Service." And this law was remarkable at the time. It was the first time that a federal law recognized disability as a class. There was a huge push for the passage of Section 504 by the disability rights movement because of this. But this achievement wasn't as big as it was at first. The Department of Health and Human Services failed to put in place any regulations based on the law, and the disability rights movement had to work even harder for this department to actually do its job and make these regulations. Now, in addition to legislative means, there were several court cases that made it all the way to the Supreme Court, where change was made through litigation. And one of the earliest examples of this was Southern Community College v. Davis. Davis was applying to go to medical school, but was partially deaf and read lips to understand others. The medical school that she applied to denied her application. Davis sued, saying that she would have been accepted if she could hear normally, and that this violated Section 504. The court disagreed and ruled that Section 504 only applied when the disabled person could still act in spite of their handicap. Here, the court limited the meaning of Section 504 to include dangerous examples, which could exclude disabled people from getting the benefits that they rightfully deserve. Now, later on in the 70s, Congress amended the Rehabilitation Act and gave people suing for disability discrimination the same resources that were provided in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This became important in a later court decision, Consolidated Rail Corporation v. DRM. Now, Darren was a worker at a coal mine who was injured on the job, and they needed their arm to be amputated. They were then fired from their job for not being able to work. There were questions relating to how the Civil Rights Act of 1964 worked with the Rehabilitation Act with this amendment, and also if Section 504 applied to only those receiving federal money for employment, not just everybody who was receiving federal money. It was decided that with Congress's amendment to the Rehabilitation Act, their intent was clear and that it applied to all programs which receive federal funding. This strengthened Section 504 and made sure that everybody who was suing for disability discrimination got the assistance that they needed, and that everybody that needed to sue for disability discrimination, everybody who was protected under the Act, was able to do so. Now the next case is School Board of Nassau County v. Arlene. So in this case, Jean Arlene was fired from her teaching job due to her having recurring tuberculosis. Now, she schooled the school district for discriminating against her, arguing that this recurring tuberculosis made her disabled. Now, there is a basic definition of disability in the Rehabilitation Act, but it was not clear whether Arlene fit this definition of disabled, and so it was unclear if she could even sue for discrimination. Now, the Supreme Court ruled that Arlene's tuberculosis was in fact a disability. They came to this conclusion by reasoning that Arlene was qualified to teach outside of having tuberculosis, and therefore it was a tuberculosis which was preventing her from doing her job. Arlene received benefits after this case was decided, and while this case might seem like it's kind of small, it had a lot of impacts, especially for the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And at the time, HIV/AIDS was really a big thing, and so this case was very closely followed because it also meant that people with HIV/AIDS classified as having a disability. Now, the next big milestone was the Americans with Disabilities Act. It was first proposed in 1988, with some of the major sponsors of the bill being Senator Tom Harkin of Iowa, Ted Kennedy of Massachusetts, Major R. Owen from New York, and Anthony Colo from California. Now, Tom Harkin had a brother who was disabled, and Representative Colo had epilepsy, and that's one of the main reasons that he chose to go to Congress. And so the bill originated from members of Congress who were close to the issue of disability and by members who had a priority to protect disabled rights. And while this is good, the struggle for the Americans with Disabilities Act was very hard fought. It took 2 more years and another session of Congress in order to even get the momentum to start passing the legislation. And this required a huge effort from the disability rights movement to get members of Congress to support the legislation. And the disability rights movement was unified and up to the challenge. Many members of Congress wanted to limit the scope of the ADA, and many proposed amendments to the bill that had to be fought. Most notable are 2 attempts to not include mental disabilities as protected class, or to not include people with HIV/AIDS as part of a protected class. Luckily, through a lot of struggle, the final bill was not watered down, and it was almost not passed due to not including some restrictions. George Bush signed the bill into law on July 26, 1990, and it was a huge, huge win for the disabled rights movement. After the passage of the ADA, there was still more judicial litigation that would follow. The first important case was Bragdon v. Abbott. In 1997, a dentist refused to treat a patient because she had HIV. She sued, saying that this constituted medical discrimination under the ADA. This case highlights the importance of Nassau County v. Arlene. If disease was not considered a disability in that case, then there would not have been grounds for Abbott to sue. The court ruled by a 5-4 vote that the dentist, and medical providers generally, cannot refuse care based on disability, as long as the disability is not a clear and present threat to their work. Since the woman had HIV, and it was a dentist, HIV is not a clear and present threat in that situation, so she was being discriminated against. Now, the next case was Sutton v. United Airlines. This case ruled that if a person had corrective measures, then they do not count as disabled. This kind of strayed from the path of the meaning of disability that was originally set out in Section 504 in the Rehabilitation Act and the ADA. Just because a person has hearing aids does not mean that they will never face discrimination based on being hard of hearing. And the court did not go into detail about the scope of the decision, although generally it is only understood to apply to relatively simple measures, kind of like glasses, which is pretty reasonable. I wear glasses, and I wouldn't consider myself disabled because of my glasses. I would if I wasn't wearing my glasses. But it's just the Supreme Court kind of was making an exception here, and it was just a little bit iffy on the extent to which this could be used. Now, the last case is Olmsted v. Elsie. Now, this was the defining case of the disability rights movement. Now, at this time, society had had a long history of putting the disabled in a corner and shunning them from society. This process is called institutionalization and was extremely terrible for the rights of the disabled. These institutions where disabled people were put into, they had horrible conditions and were terrible to live in. In Georgia, one woman was not allowed to leave psychiatric isolation even though she met the requirements to leave. She sued, saying that not being allowed to leave isolation was a violation of her rights. Georgia argued that financial constraints kept Elsie in her ward. Now, the court ruled that this was discrimination. They also ruled that keeping the disabled in institutions without any reason violated the patient's rights. This ended the pattern of institutionalization and mandated that the disabled should be allowed to live in society if they want to. This decision was the end of segregation between the disabled and the non-disabled. This decision basically ended the disability version of separate but equal, and was a landmark case. And now there have been more developments in the last 20 years. There was a Supreme Court case in, I think, 2003 that prevented the death penalty for people who had mental disabilities, arguing that that was cruel and unusual punishment. There's also been the Affordable Care Act, which has improved medical care and prevented health insurance companies from discriminating against disabled people. But after the passage of the ADA, the disability rights movement kind of began to die down, and so those achievements and those growths have been less focused on the disability rights movement. They've just kind of been there. And so, since I specifically wanted to talk about the disability rights movement, sadly, that is all I have time for today. So, I'd like to thank you for watching. I hope this was interesting and informative. Goodbye.